there, freaks and creeps out there. So I got another video on the symbols and stories over at Riverside Cemetery. They got a part 3. Get ready. And don't forget, hey guys, subscribe. That way you get the new videos when they first come out. And also, did you know that Riverside Cemetery is a non-profit? That means they rely on donations for the beautification, any kind of stuff that they have to do to fix up like the chapel or any area around the tombstones and stuff like that, cutting grass, you know, any kind of maintenance that they have to do for these things, they rely on donations. Because unfortunately some of the families have passed on. They've been. At the end of the video I will have where you could send your donations to, and if you would like to visit them, the address of where it's located. So watch the video all the way to the end. Don't forget to subscribe. Hope you enjoy the movie.
James Hay. He was born in Scotland, came to Cleveland at just 3 years old, and as an adult enlisted in the 5th Michigan Volunteers in 1861. What's really cool about him is not just that he fought in the Civil War, but he fought at Gettysburg. And I don't know why, but something about the Civil War buff in me thinks that's extra cool. In September of 1864, he was honorably discharged, and in January of 1929, he contracted influenza and unfortunately a few days later had passed away. At his time of passing, he did not have any living relatives except for 2 nieces that were not local. If you look at this stone right here, where it says Mother Margaret Hay, 3 sons, 2 grandsons, that is not her achievements. The Margaret, the 3 sons, and the 2 grandsons are all in that grave together in a common grave, as they were moved from Erie Street Cemetery.
I went on a complete journey trying to find what exactly the rifle on this tombstone meant. There's a lot of different symbols that have to do with rifles, especially with veterans. Most common you'll see is the crossed rifles, and then there's the one that's pointing down, like where it's called the soldier's cross, where like the helmet is on top of it, it's pointing into the ground. I could not, for the life of me, find out at first what the pointing up rifle was. And then I started to dig a little bit more into particularly Gettysburg, when she had found out that that's where he had served. So the particular symbol of the rifle pointing up was reserved for the infantry who fought for the Union at the Battle of Gettysburg. If you look at a lot of the monuments and tombstones of other very wealthy Gettysburg veterans, they almost all have that same symbol of it pointing up. The only place, that was really the only one I'd seen. And then the great mystery for both of us is, what is the curly stuff at the bottom of the tomb? And at first I thought possibly it was just faded, but the rifle is so clear and crisp that I'm like, if it was faded, wouldn't the rest of it, be faded as well? So my best guess in judging from looking at the other Gettysburg grave markers is that it's actually smoke. It's a little bit more clear in some of the other ones that I've found, where usually they have like the battlefield kind of etched out onto the monument. So I believe that is smoke down there. And then of course the rifle. The garland is just a regular holly garland. Holly is typically used for things like renewal, rebirth, remembrance. But it was such a unique one. I could literally only find 3 veteran monuments that had this rifle, but when I started to dig deeper into the genealogy on it, it was really reserved for the Union veterans at the time. So it's pretty cool. We had a lot of fun with that one. One of the more notable monuments in the cemetery, it kind of reminds me of the footstool in Beauty and the Beast, with the little legs at the bottom. So this tomb shape is somewhere between a pedestal tomb and a sarcophagus tomb. Now, if you've been on the other tours that we've done, the sarcophagus tomb we've kind of covered, but it doesn't quite meet the soup tureen shape that a sarcophagus tomb has. It definitely looks more like a pedestal tomb, which usually is raised off the ground, at 4 points. Very uncommon. It's really a cross between the two. What really makes this stand out is the feet on it. So at first glance, when I was doing my research, I thought that they were lion's feet because they're kind of hairy and scraggly looking. But after doing some more look-see into it, the feet are actually of the mythical beast, a griffin. So the shape of the feet with the talons, like claws, show a cross between a lion and an eagle, which is what a griffin is. In Christian mythology, the griffin was actually associated with evil up until the 14th century. For some reason, the pre-Renaissance artists decided to start painting the griffin as the symbol of goodness, particularly the symbol of the duality of Christ. He is both human and divine, correlating with the griffin, who is both part of heaven, the eagle, and earth, the lion. So in using the griffin on a grave, the message they want to convey is usually that this person was once of this world, but now resides in another.
Okay, so a lot of the research that I do, I end up getting information from an obituary, pulling old newspaper files. Unfortunately, Dr. Charles Humiston did not have an obituary written about him. What I could find is that he married a woman by the name of Martha Aiken. Martha was the sister of the philanthropist Bertha McMyler. Bertha McMyler will be on our next tour. We may be able to see as we pass by, there's really beautiful columns. He was a prominent surgeon and physician and was called to speak during several cases that went to court regarding insanity hearings. He suffered an injury to his shoulder in 1893, and it would seem that things just weren't the same after. In 1895, a suit was brought against him. Very little detail is given. What I know is that it was at the Women's and Children's Hospital, and he agreed to certain contingencies if a penalty was withheld. And that may be due in the part that many of the unnamed charges were not able to be proved in court. Additionally, one of the contingencies was that he no longer practiced. In 1903, Martha filed for divorce. Her health was failing due to cancer, and the two had been living in separate parts of the home for the last 2 years. Martha pleaded with the judge to expedite her case. Law stated back then that one must wait 6 weeks after the other party is served, but due to her poor health, the judge agreed to allow the case be heard at 6 weeks and 1 day after Dr. Humiston was served. The divorce was granted on the grounds of gross neglect of duty. Now, anyone who walked over there to take a look at the tomb, you may have noticed that there's a lot of open space and one headstone. There are 16 people buried on that lot. Dr. Humiston has his big giant griffin tomb, and then he has his own stone as well. The other people on the lot are not marked at all. This is including a child, siblings of Dr. Humiston, his parents, and his parents. Their son Hiram and his mother are buried on Hiram's lot, which is over by Bertha McMyler. The name of his parents, well, his dad is Ransom Humiston. On the way over here today, I tried to look up some information about him, so I don't have a lot other than he took over what was known as the Cleveland Institute, which was Tremont. It was, for a short time, while it was open, a rival of Oberlin College, and it's notable in the sense that it was the first private college available within the city.
Who's on the other side of Jones Monument, and yeah, it's a big one. So boulders and large stones have actually been associated with burials since the beginning of human history. Cultures from all over the world have used enormous rocks to just like mark where their dead are. In the context of the Victorians, we've talked a little bit about in earlier ones the significance of stones before and what they typically mean. But rocks of this size, like how big it is, represents stability, resilience, and also the rock that covered the tomb of Christ. So you can totally bring resurrection into that mix as well. A lot of times, these giant rocks would be actually moved from the property of the person who was deceased. And they would use them as the monument. You know, at the time, land was very much a thing of pride, and they wanted to bring a piece of their home with them into eternity.
Carlos Jones was born in New Jersey, 1827, and came to Ohio in 1831. As a young boy, he made some money on a farm as a farmhand in Parma. He felt the work on the farm was a little too slow-paced for him, and so he came back to the city with his earnings and opened up a small shop. After making some money at the shop, he then closed up and began manufacturing agricultural implements. This was the business that made him a millionaire. Carlos had 3 wives. His first wife, Delia, was a Brainerd, and together they had a son, Marvin Jones. Marvin died while swimming in the Cuyahoga River, although it would state in New Jersey papers, based on a rumor, that he died in a well. That's not true. He did unfortunately drown, but it was while swimming in the Cuyahoga River. Next was Susan Barlow, and together they had a daughter named Daisy. Susan and Carlos divorced, and next came Mary Brainerd Rowley, and they had no children. Mary was previously married to Martin Rowley, hence the Rowley on the other side, and together they had 3 children who all died before reaching adulthood, and they are all buried on this lot, along with Martin Rowley, who also died very young at 33 years old. Now, shortly after Carlos's first wife and son had passed, he had to consider what he might do with his inheritance. He knew that he couldn't leave it to his son anymore, and that was his initial plan. And his daughter Daisy was very well cared for by her husband, who happened to be a doctor. Shortly after the death of his wife, he went to hear a sermon that was given by his nephew, Reverend Jones. During the sermon, it was told about a story of a woman who passed and left behind a daughter who screamed and cried and wanted to be buried with her mother because she'd be orphaned without her. And that touched Carlos, and that story stayed with him for a very long time, knowing that this girl was forced into an orphanage without any family to care for her. After Carlos and Mary were married, together with their interest in children and caring for children and Cleveland charities, they decided to open the Jones Home for Friendless Children. Now, to get Brooklyn on board with their ex-mayor's grand plan, he included the opening of the first public library in Brooklyn Village, which grew excitement and anticipation. Carlos assembled his board, which included the ex-president, Rutherford B. Hayes, Isaac Lamson, Samuel Sessions, and Judge James Coffinberry, just to name a few. The Jones Home for Friendless Children was open immediately because Carlos and Mary opened their own home to the first 12 children until the construction of the permanent facility was complete. Jones did not want his institution to be like a typical orphanage. He did not want people to have children that were in temporary quarters, not learning anything, and so he set it up to be like a school. The children were educated, and they were brought up with home training, as he called it. He saw that these orphans and homeless children were severely lacking an environment that would set them up to improve their situation into adulthood. This is why he had that set up that way. The library was established by the Jones Library Association and named in the memory of his first wife, Delia Jones. Together, Carlos and Mary spent the remainder of their lives dedicated to charity work. At the time of Mary's passing, any property that was still owned by her or Carlos Jones was to be sold and put into a fund called the Jones and Rowley Fund, which would support the home. We know the home today as Applewood Center, right across the street over there. It is run through Children's Services and United Way and offers psychiatric care and residential treatment for emotionally strained children. Okay. Laying right in front of us is the grave for Christian and Cora Narton. Christian was a German immigrant coming to Cleveland at 17 years old. The two married and had 5 children. His first job upon arriving to Cleveland was at the Weidman Tiedemann Company, and eventually made his way through the company being the president in 1928. He only held that position until 1931, at which point his son, Lyman, took over. In 1928, Cora had become disabled, likely due to her age, and spent most of her time in her bed with a nurse's aide. In August of 1933, Christian was diagnosed with stomach flu. Not just any stomach flu, but what we know now as the norovirus, which we have a wonderful vaccine for now. He became very weak, worrying the family and staff at Weidman Company, and after suffering for about 10 days, on August 17th of 1933, Christian Narton passed away. It also happened to be their 52nd wedding anniversary. Now, as you can see, they both have a date of passing on there as 1933. Cora, she passed, and according to our records, she passed away on August 21st from a cerebral hemorrhage. She never knew of her husband's death. Newspapers have conflicting stories. I had to do a lot of research to figure out what was the true story, and what makes the most sense to me was a little unfortunate. It sounds to me like the nurse's aide did not tell Cora of her husband's passing in fear that it would harm her because of her bad health. Unfortunately, Cora was very stubborn and felt like it was necessary to try to make her way down the stairs to check on her husband that she hadn't seen in a couple of days, at which point she did fall down the stairs and had that cerebral hemorrhage that unfortunately made her pass away. There was only one newspaper that, I guess, published that, and they were forced to make a retraction on that, and I do believe that they were forced to do so because it made the nurse look bad. But our records show that there's 3 days difference. All of the other papers say that she died only within an hour after his passing. So I guess we'll never know.
Okay, so this particular slab-looking grave is really unique for the time period that it was probably bought in. They probably didn't buy it when they died, or a couple of years before. It was most likely bought before that time. But usually you see these flat graves in older cemeteries, like pre-Civil War, or you'll see them in newer cemeteries after, like, I don't know, probably like 1940. So this particular kind, which is just it's called a slab grave or a ledger grave because it kind of looks like a book almost. You'll see this style in older tombs. Usually the person's entire life story is written out on these. If you ever go down south, that is a big thing. You can actually read the whole life story of the people. This has a much cleaner, more modern look for the time it was placed there. These type of grave markers have been found in all kinds of different cultures all over the world, but they are particularly found in the Celtic tradition, believe it or not. Usually the Celtic ones that I've seen have the Celtic knotwork around it, like the Book of Kells. So it's just such a unique one. I think there's only one other tomb over in the cemetery that is just the slab that doesn't have like a tombstone that comes up after it. And I was like, oh, we gotta feature that one. It's too cool not to. I want to take a look at this big beauty over here. So the Weidman tomb is a different shape than a sarcophagus tomb. As we spoke about earlier with the big, what was it, Hemiston's grave? Hemiston's grave. This also has kind of the shape of a sarcophagus tomb, but again, it doesn't have that like soup tureen looking roundness to it. This particular style is actually reminiscent of the types used by the Romans and Greeks starting around like 300 BC. There's actually another one that we're going to be looking at today that also is in that same style, just a little bit of a different shape. The unique parts of this tomb is the shell adornments on the tops. If you look at the corners, you can see the shells over there. Typically, shells are reserved for children's graves, but in this case, we have them at every edge and peak. The shell, while often associated with John the Baptist and the renewal of life, can also mean the start of a pilgrimage or the end of a journey, which I feel is very apropos for a tombstone.
John C. Weidman was also a German immigrant. At 2 years old, he moved from Germany to Medina, and at 17 came to Cleveland. He began work with the W.J. Gordon Grocery. He rapidly worked his way through that line of business, and at his time of death was the head of the largest wholesale grocer and liquor store in Ohio. In 1863, John Weidman partnered with Hans Tiedemann in the grocery and liquor business. Yes, that is Hans Tiedemann of Franklin Castle. In addition to his own business, John was also the president of Forest City Savings and director in the Union National Bank and the Savings and Trust Bank. He was affiliated with the Masonic fraternity as a member of the Bigelow Lodge, which was the very first Masonic lodge on the west side of Cleveland. He was also affiliated with Forest City Commandery, which is another Masonic body. He was well known for being very liberal with his donations, although he always did so in a quiet manner and without any recognition. The only political position he ever held, despite being begged to run by all who knew him, was police commissioner of Cleveland from 1876 to 1880. Weidman had been warned leading up to his death that his heart was not in good condition. He was told to stay home, rest, and be mindful of everything that his physician was telling him. It was at the dinner table that he sank to the ground and passed away from a heart attack. His estate was left to his second wife, 2 children, and several family members, as well as charities. On this lot, but not discussed at this time, is Omar Mueller, who is a Cleveland brewer, and John's son, Henry Weidman, which was his successor.
So there are many different types of architecture to be found in the large Victorian monuments. From classic Grecian with its stately columns, Italian Renaissance showing off ornate extravagance, Baroque edifices that showcase the 16th century romance through its arches and curves, up to the clean modern elegance of Art Deco. Yet none, I think, can inspire such reverence and awe as the imposing spires as the Gothic style. I mean, it looks like Notre Dame, right? Very recognizable. The Lamson Sessions grave is one such a sight. Housed inside its cathedral-like ceiling is the angel Gabriel. Identified by his horn, Gabriel, of course, is most commonly depicted as, the Annunciation of Christ with Mary, but in this case, he's associated with the announcement of death. So a soul is leaving the earth and going into heaven. There is a lot of classic Gothic architecture that's around it. Not all of it has really any specific meaning. A lot of it is plants and flowers that don't really exist in real life. There is 2 sayings that are etched around the top. Do you think I remembered to write them down? Absolutely not. They're very clear and you can definitely read them down, but it's probably one of the most striking, I think, monuments that I've ever come across. And unfortunately, the horn, Gabriel's horn, is broken. It would have been like a curly, kind of a French horn looking thing. Gabriel is actually the second most used angel in Victorian cemetery iconography. The first is Michael.
All right, Lamson and Sessions. To piggyback off of the monument speak for just a moment, that monument right there was brought here in the late 1800s at a cost of $10,000. Today, that would be equal to about $28 million. So, kind of costly. There is a lot to unpack here. It's important for me to mention that I'm not going to be able to cover everything. On this lot, there are 4 major gentlemen that had a lot to do with Cleveland history. Isaac Lamson, Thomas Lamson, Samuel Sessions, and John Gould Jennings. So, where do we start? Genealogically speaking, Isaac and Thomas were brothers. Isaac married Fanny Sessions. Fanny Sessions was Samuel Sessions' younger sister. Together, they had one child by the name of Lillian, who grew up and married John Gould Jennings. Got it? Thomas Lamson, the older of the 2, was first in business with Samuel Sessions in Connecticut in 1866. In 1868, Isaac joined the business, and the following year they moved from Connecticut to Cleveland to build a sizable factory. Unfortunately, in 1871, that factory was lost to fire and they were forced to rebuild. However, they were very determined to not stay closed for long, and after only 5 weeks, production was resumed and the company was booming. They remained at their first location until 1882 when, due to high demand, they relocated. And it is at this point, unfortunately, that Thomas Lamson leaves our story. He's passed in August of 1882. The following year, the business became incorporated as Lamson and Sessions Company. Samuel held the position of president, Isaac the vice president, and John G. Jennings the treasurer. This new facility was packed with state-of-the-art machinery, most of which was patented by the company themselves. Lamson and Sessions was producing bolts for carriages, tires, stoves, machines, and agricultural devices, as well as wrenches, nuts, and rivets. And on eBay, you can buy all of that stuff. Don't ask me how I know. The business spread internationally to Canada, England, France, and Australia. In 1895, the Plain Dealer did a piece about the ever-growing industrial city of Cleveland and why people should move out west to Cleveland. They used Lamson and Sessions' business and their prosperity to entice people to come over and move to Cleveland. Over the next 128 years, the Lamson and Sessions Company hit all-time highs and lows, acquired and merged with several corporations, and changed with the times. They restricted their manufacturing model and successfully had their stock traded on the New York Stock Exchange. As of June of 2023, Lamson and Sessions Company and its subsidiaries hold a net worth of $430 million, with 14 locations across U.S. and Canada, employing roughly 1,400 people. Of those 1,400 people, about 22% of them are almost always graduates from CSU. So some quick-ish facts about each person individually. Thomas Lamson, he knew he was sick with kidney disease, but his dedicated interest in the construction of that new factory caused him to go against orders. Seems to be a theme here, right? Ultimately, it did hasten his death. Thomas had a wife named Abigail, who remarried after his passing to a man named Charles Olney. Charles moved into the home that she owned with Thomas, which is still standing on West 14th Street, along with Samuel Sessions and Isaac's home, which was next door. Charles, who is buried back at his hometown cemetery in Connecticut, had an immense love of art. Abigail, wishing to please her husband, displayed all of his art in such a way that it would be appealing to the public and opened their home as the first art gallery in Cleveland, predating the Cleveland Museum of Art by almost 20 years. That is still open, by the way. If you wanted to look that up, you could actually go and visit. They have a bed and breakfast there. They host wedding events, things like that. Isaac Lamson, in addition to his interests in the business, he also pursued a career in politics. He was a judge for the Cleveland Civil Court. He was a presidential elector during the election of Benjamin Harrison, was a part of nominating committee for President William McKinley, and was heavily involved in several other civic activities in Cleveland. And finally, most important to us, he was a founding trustee for Riverside Cemetery. Samuel Sessions also had interests outside of the business, including banking and real estate. On one occasion, Sessions sold property to a man named Luke Sr. That story is for another tour. Let's just say it did not go well. He also was a founding member, a founding trustee for Riverside Cemetery. Next, John Gould Jennings, husband of Lillian Lamson, was the treasurer of Lamson and Sessions. In 1889, Mr. Jennings went to the bank and withdrew $3,900 from the company's account, supposedly to pay their employees. This is equivalent to about $120,000 today. Jennings boarded a streetcar, set his satchel down under his seat, and paid no mind to it until he arrived at a stop when he noticed, the bag is missing. Jennings went to the police to make a report, was followed by a passenger who claimed to witness the robber, but didn't say anything because he assumed the satchel belonged to him. According to the report, Jennings asked the papers not be notified of this report, which struck the lieutenant as quite odd, and he notified the papers right away. Additionally, when the lieutenant did follow up with Jennings, Jennings told him that the money hadn't been located, but it's not missed. Don't worry about it. You don't need to keep looking. John Colgis. John and his brother Frank were in the meatpacking industry and butchers. John retired early from the business, leaving his younger brother to run it. He retired early due to a heart condition that caused him to feel weak with rapid heartbeats. Hey, a guy who listened. John heard of a brand of new medicine called Dr. Miles' Heart Cure. This medicine was advertised to cure heart ailments. However, after a few years on this medication, John passed of heart disease. Ironically, Dr. Miles' company still used his testimony of how well it worked until 1904, which was 5 years after he passed away. Dr. Miles' company is still in business today. However, it's better known as Bayer. And they still market as being the medicine to take for a heart attack.
There was probably like a lot of opium and possibly cocaine in that.
There actually, okay, so there was like a high level of sodium something that I can't pronounce in it, which we know now at high levels is absolutely lethal.
Yeah, Victorian medicine was a journey, if you ever want to look into it. Okay, so this beautiful, beautiful monument, I feel like it really is just a masterclass in the stonemasonry that went into a lot of the cemetery art. The flowers on the front of the grave are daisies. And if you look at the ones that are up at the top points there, those are daisies. So those are symbolizing the Virgin Mary's love. What they're trying to represent is that daisies can kind of grow everywhere, just like Mary's love will find you anywhere, which can sound a little ominous. The leafy adornments around like the base and then on the top, those are something we've actually featured before called acanthus. They adorn, usually we're on like Grecian and Roman tombs, and their whole meaning with them is that they are about man overcoming the curse of Adam and Eve in Genesis. So of course, you know, they were condemned and then they've overcome it. It's eternal life. The figure on top is not a virtue as far as I can tell, not one of the 7 virtues, but the arms outstretched like this always are associated with the plea of mercy. So the spirit is ascending into heaven, and if you notice, she's standing on top of a sphere. Spheres are one of 2 things. They are either super decorative or they are representative of a globe. And in this case, she is ascending from earth into heaven with her arms outstretched, begging for mercy. So I love it. I think that his face is great. You know, he's got a lot of character.
Okay, one more fun fact, because I almost forgot to mention it. So John's father's name is John, and his mother's name is Margaret, and he married a Margaret, and so that got really confusing. But additionally, his brother Frank also married a Margaret. So, talk about some fun research. So, I'll start by saying I had to look up how to say the name. There are 2 conflicting things. I guess it depends on if you're using the English pronunciation or the German. I've seen Teufel and I've seen Teufel. Teufel or Teufel in German means devil. When Christian Teufel, who we're going to speak a little bit about, came over to America, he wanted to change his last name because he did not like coming over here and finding out that everyone knew already his last name meant devil. That he was afraid that people would not go into business with him. So that, I saw court hearings on that, and I thought that was kind of interesting. So Christian lived between Chicago and Cleveland. He had a remarkable and trustworthy reputation. He was known for his wealth and kindness. Having a connection to Chicago, he was entrusted to be a representative of the Armour Canned Meat Company. Think Spam and Vienna sausages. A Chicago paper says, Mr. Teufel is a big, jolly, broad-shouldered German whose chief delight in life is to help the boys in the pork pit and engineer some practical jokes. The paper goes on to say that Mr. Teufel oftentimes allowed himself to be the butt of the jokes just to maintain a fun work environment. A Chicago man by the name of Old Hutch, we don't like him, Benjamin Hutchinson, was a friend of his in the wheat trading business as well as the meat packing business. Old Hutch made a bad deal in Christian's name, and Christian, being the good and honest man he was, paid back the debt in full. Mind you, this is after Christian already told Old Hutch, I don't have the money expendable for you to be making deals on my behalf. Please don't do it. Old Hutch obviously went against his wishes. Unfortunately, this put Mr. Teufel in a bad position with a new partner that he had here in Cleveland by the name of George Weddle. The two had a stone quarry on Teufel's property, and George was to manage it while Christian simply collected the royalties. The bad trade done on Old Hutch meant that Christian had to sell this particular property. The Cleveland paper wrote about Christian, questioning his sanity because he has always been a trustworthy man and had a great reputation. So why would he do something like this? Well, they failed to mention this deal in Chicago that could have bankrupted him had he not sold just this one property. I found that out in the Chicago papers. Also notable on this lot is part of the Horsburgh family, which is right here. And they're still around today in Cleveland and around about. I've spoken with them. They usually call just to make sure that the lot's looking nice, and as you can see, it's beautiful. They have a company called Horsburgh and Scott, which is located off of St. Clair and East 49th, that makes very large gears and machines. They have a scholarship program that they have donated to for years at Case Western Reserve. The great-great-granddaughter of Christian Teufel is Mrs. Carolyn, where's Carolyn? Carolyn, right in front of me, is Mrs. Carolyn Horsburgh. Now, while researching, I came across her obituary from when she passed in 2014. Something I thought was really cool, that I've never seen or read about before, without having a personal connection anyways, is that she actually competed in the Special Olympics. She took home gold medals in swimming, bowling, and several equestrian sports. She also made her home in DeLand, Florida, before eventually coming back up here, and donated her time to the Faith Riders, not the motorcycle club, but the equestrian club.
So I had to kind of laugh when you said he was the Spam, because I feel like his grave kind of looks like a can of Spam in its squareness. I have wanted to feature this one for a while because the thistle that's in the very middle there. So you're looking at this and going, there's not a lot to it, but that thistle, that single flower in the middle of the U, is pretty significant. So the lone thistle on this grave may look small, but this little flower has a huge history and meaning. The thistle engraved on a gravestone may identify that the deceased was a native of Scotland, because the thistle is the national flower of Scotland. Now, it was kind of funny that he was German. We've yet to find the significance. Maybe he really likes Scotland. So the legend surrounding the thistle goes that during the reign of Alexander III, which happened kind of around the time of Braveheart, the movie, an invading Norse army landed in Scotland at night, and they were intent on conquering the country. To hasten their sneaky approach, they took off their shoes and walked barefoot, only then to tread on thistles. Yeah, their cries alerted the Scots to their position, and then they went into battle, and then the Scots defeated them. As with most national legends, do we think that this was 100% true? Probably not, but there's usually a grain of truth in these. The first historical use of the symbol was the founding of the Order of the Thistle, which was, and it still is currently the highest honor in Scotland. It's bestowed by the monarchy, so in this case it would be King Charles that would bestow it. It was founded in 1687 by James VII of Scotland, and its recipients wore a robe picturing hundreds of thistle motifs, so it would have been embroidered in it. The order's motto is "Nobody harms me unpunished." The thistle is symbolic of earthly sorrow, defiance, the inevitability of death, and remembrance. It is also believed that the thorns on the thistle symbolize the crown of thorns and the passion of the Christ. In this case, though, it's not so much the flowers itself that she's holding, but more it's a very paused moment. It almost looks like she's about to drop flowers onto the grave. The flowers in both hands are fresh and lively. Some of them are fully bloomed, and others are just buds. Flowers in these positions signify the fragility of life. The flowers in her hand that she appears to almost drop, show that anyone, no matter their stage of life, whether it be barely bloomed or full to bursting, can be plucked from the world of the living. So if you've ever looked at some of the artwork where they depict bouquets of flowers, and half the flowers are living and then there's the ones that are dying, this is very reminiscent of that kind of symbolism. And if you look in her hand, you've got the two little buds, so barely open, so life that really hasn't had a chance to bloom, and then the full open rose, which can either mean that life was plucked too soon or the person lived a full life. But I think it's probably one of the prettiest ones. The stuff around the corners here are just the olive branches. We've talked about those before a couple of times. But yeah, I think her whole face is just very forlorn, and she looks like she's, dropping the flowers upon their grave in remembrance.
So Christian Schul was a partner with the department store called Fries and Schul, which was located on West 25th. Prior to Christian's partnership, he was just a store clerk, and it was under the name of Fries, Klein, and Hoover. In 1879, both Klein and Hoover passed away, opening the door for Christian. The department store was then renamed Fries and Schul. As their business grew, so did a need for the incorporation of the business as well as a new building. In 1909, both of those things happened. A 5-story building replaced the old store, and in just 3 years' time, the West Side Market opened, making the spot of Fries and Schul a prime location. Sometime in the 1920s, the Fries family sold its portion of the business. The Schul family continued to run the store under the same name in hopes of not ruining their reputation of splitting of partners. This was until 1979, when the large downtown department store could not compete with the suburban malls. The company ran for almost 111 years and was the second to last remaining large department store. Any idea which one was the last to go? Higbee's. But, interestingly, Higbee only ran for 61 years. So, even though, and it technically was a little bit longer, however, at one point it was in the 90s, it switched over to just Dillard's, and so I don't count that. I do encourage you to visit both sides. Of course, this side is beautiful. It's probably the more appealing side, but on the other side you can see the names of the people listed that are buried here. So we'll start with Frederick, patriarch of the family. He was a director and manufacturer of the American Multigraph Company, which was an envelope addressing service. His wife, Lou, lived very comfortably after his passing and gave a lot of time to mentoring young girls, donating money to several Cleveland charities, and keeping up her involvement in social clubs like the Lakewood Garden Club and the Young Women's Christian Association. Their son, Dr. Robert Stecker, was the only child of 3 to live into old age. Dr. Stecker worked for Metro Hospital originally, looking to be a heart specialist, but changed to rheumatic diseases. He spent his career dedicated to the study of arthritis and for a better understanding of the disease. He was a founding trustee of the Arthritis Rheumatism Foundation, sat on the board of several medical associations, was an honorary board member to 13 foreign organizations in this field, and was a trustee for the National Medical Library in D.C. In addition to his medical obligations, Dr. Stecker also held a trustee position for the Cleveland Zoological Society, Museum of Natural History, and Fenn College. In 1969, he donated $748,000 to the zoo to fund the construction of a hospital for the animals. This facility was equipped with some winter housing for animals, an autopsy room, surgery center, laboratories, veterinary offices, record rooms, and more. Unfortunately, Dr. Stecker passed away in 1972, just 6 months before the completion of the building. It was never the intention to name the building after him. However, they did name the building the Stecker Building in his honor, and his family and friends were invited to the dedication ceremony. This building does still stand today. However, it is behind the gates, so it's not the one animal hospital that you see where like the rhinos were. This is going to be back behind by like the maintenance facility, and they do still use it for its intended purposes.
Alrighty, so this absolute work of art shows off the kind of newer style at the time that this was constructed, known as bas relief. This style, while it was made popular in the 1920s and the 1930s, it was originally used by the Greeks and Romans for a long time to represent battles, emperors, gods, goddesses, and of course, epitaphs. So if you remember when we looked at Mr. Weidman's tomb down there, I said that it was reminiscent of the style that you would see along, the road into Rome where they had all of the graves. This is another style. They would make it kind of look like a Greek or a Roman temple. And then, of course, that looks like a pitcher, but it's actually an urn in the middle. And we know from our other tours that urns, of course, were replacing the death's heads. That was supposed to be a representation of the fragility of life, that all of us are eventually going to end up in a pot, apparently. But this looks almost exactly like the little houses that they would construct out of stone for the dead along the Appian Way. And I love it. I've been wanting to feature this one too in a while.